what I don't quite understand at this time is the police were not called until about noon the next day. That's the information we have.
Well, I don't know that it would last that long, but maybe there's another explanation. Maybe she was afraid. Maybe she was in denial about what she was seeing. Maybe, she had been consuming alcohol. There's any number of reasons that she could have delayed it. But obviously, I don't think it was for any nefarious purpose. I just think it was probably her particular response to something that she couldn't believe that she was seeing. It's also possible that maybe she told herself that maybe this is related to one of the other roommates, that someone else is in the home. We just won't really know.
Now that the arrest affidavit has been released and every person and their dog is reading it aloud, there's not much else to uncover. So I decided to take a different approach than I stated in episode 1. Instead, I want to talk about a range of topics like hindsight bias, survivor's guilt, PTSD and other psychology topics, and probably a little bit about law later. In this episode, I want to tell you about 3 scenarios I found myself in and how I reacted in each case. And each scenario is loosely related to this case. What I'd like you to do is to think of a scenario that you experienced and share it with us in the comments. And if you feel so compelled, maybe we can do a live stream later and have some of you come up to describe your scenario in more detail and how you initially reacted versus how you feel about it now. And so that's what I'd like to do, is sort of describe the scenario that I experienced, how I reacted to it, and then how I dealt with it afterwards. So the first scenario, the year is, I think it's like 1999, 2000, somewhere like that. And it was the weekend, Saturday night. I was very hungover from Friday night. It was one of those rare scenarios where I tried to drink with my friend and found that, yes, I have a severe reaction with alcohol. So by Saturday night, I was not feeling well still. Anyway, we ordered in pizza. So it's myself and my housemate. We ordered in pizza and I said, I'm going to bed. I can't eat. Save me a piece of pizza. She had said that she and her friend were going to have some drinkies and go clubbing. So when I went to bed, this is what I expected to be hearing while I was sleeping, was my housemate and her friend having drinkies before going clubbing. So around midnight, I was woken by the music and the partying going on out in the living room, but I didn't think anything of it because my friend had said this is what they were doing. So I just assumed it was her and her friend doing exactly that. And then at about 2 or 3, I was woken again, and they were getting quite loud by this stage. Not that I was annoyed, because I already knew what they said they were going to be doing. I just remember thinking, yep, that's my housemate and her friend doing that, and going back to sleep. So the next morning, when I woke up, I was quite hungry because I didn't eat the night before. I went looking for the pizza, and I looked in the fridge and there was no pizza. In fact, I couldn't even find the box. And I was like, they said they'd save me a piece. So still not quite annoyed, just wondering what the hell. I made a coffee and went out to the back porch to have a cigarette, and then I looked out on the lawn and all my CDs were like thrown out onto the back lawn. And by this stage I was actually getting a little bit annoyed. She normally wouldn't disrespect my things, so I noticed a couple of other things and I can't remember them off the top of my head, but a little while later she woke up and she came out and she was wondering why I looked annoyed, like what's up? And I was like, well, you said you were going to leave me some pizza. She said, I did leave you some pizza, and she went to the fridge to open it and saw there was no pizza there, and then she just looked at me with a blank stare. I was standing between her and the kitchen table. She looked sort of past me and realised that her bottle of vodka was missing from the kitchen table. She was like panicked at this stage. Wait, my vodka's missing. Went looking for a purse. Her purse was missing. Anyway, we kind of realised that a whole bunch of stuff had been taken. At this point, we're realising we'd been broken into. Going through our timelines together, she said she left at about 11 PM to go clubbing. So all the noises from midnight onwards that I heard were not her and a friend partying, it was someone else who had broken into my apartment, were eating our food, drinking our alcohol, obviously didn't like my music, so they tossed it all on the lawn, and generally having a good time at our expense. Anyway, that's how I felt at the time. Like I didn't think anything of it because I knew my friend was there and I knew that she had a guest and I knew what was going on. That, however, was not what was going on. Then afterwards, I started sleeping with a baseball bat under my bed. It's not because I thought maybe at some point I might walk outside and find my flatmates slaughtered. That's the last thing that crossed my mind. I just felt violated, and so, I wanted to be able to chase someone out if they were inside my apartment doing something like this again. So that's the hindsight bias, like now I sleep with a baseball bat under my bed, but it didn't cross my mind beforehand. In fact, it only just occurred to me during this case that this thought never ever crossed my mind, that I could wake up one day and find my entire household had been slaughtered while I was sleeping. So, do I think that the inaction of the other flatmates was unusual or strange or anything like that? No, I don't. The last thing that would have gone through their minds is that they were going to wake up the next day to what they woke up to. Also, let me add that no, we didn't call the police. We had a fair idea who had broken in and who had done it, but we really had no evidence to prove anything. So yeah, in hindsight, had we had a doorbell cam or something like that, then maybe we would have had the evidence. But as it stood, all we had was evidence that someone had broken in, and that was it. It would be many, many years later, decades in fact, before I sort of realised the benefit of having some type of camera surveillance around the outside of our house. Even though we live in the middle of freaking nowhere at the end of a dead-end road, where you wouldn't think you would need camera surveillance. Which brings us to the second scenario. So this time, I was sitting at home, I was sewing and I had the TV on pretty loud, which is situated between where I was sewing and the front door. So I didn't really hear anything leading up to hearing over the sound of my TV what seemed like an argument going on outside my cabin. I lowered the volume on the TV to listen in to who the voices were, and I didn't actually recognise any of the voices. What I could hear was two men yelling, and I had never heard my landlord yelling, so I wasn't sure if it was him. He also has two brothers. I'd never heard them yelling, so I wasn't sure if it was them. It was all just really, really strange. The first thing that crossed my mind was if this was an argument between the brothers or something. It was obviously serious, they were obviously cranky about something, and I didn't want to poke my nose into somebody else's business. So I stood just behind the curtains of my front windows to listen in and hear what was being said. But it didn't sound to me like a regular argument between two brothers. It sounded like it had escalated and there was punching going on. Like I could hear the thuds from 30 to 50 metres away. So at this point I realised I had to put my big girl pants on and open the door and see what was going on and who it actually was. So I took a deep breath and I pulled the door back and I stepped out onto the first step outside my door and I shouted in the direction of the yelling, "What the F is going on out here?" Bear in mind, it's like just gone dusk. It's not quite dark, but it's dusk. I can see a vehicle parked in the driveway with its headlights sort of shining past my cabin, and it's not a vehicle that I recognise. And I can see two people out in the shed where my landlord parks his car, and we keep a paddock basher type vehicle plus a tractor and a couple of other things. And they're not people that I recognise. And I can't see who they're hitting because that person is obviously on the ground between the paddock basher and the tractor. But I can see these two guys and their heads bobbing up and down while they're punching towards the ground. So the second thing that goes through my mind is, do I even know these people or even who they're punching on the ground? Is this just something that has erupted outside of our property and someone's run in here for protection or something? And maybe that's just my brain wanting to think of a scenario where it wasn't someone I actually knew on the ground being punched. But indeed it was, as I found out a little bit later. So once these two characters see me and hear me, they quickly run out of the shed, jump in their vehicle, reverse up the driveway and take off. There was this finite period of time where I should have been thinking I need to take that number plate, or you guys call it a tag, a vehicle tag. I should have taken that number down so that we could work out who it was. But this didn't occur to me at the time that they were reversing out the driveway. I had full clear view of it too, but it didn't occur to me. I was more worried about who was on the floor in the shed and what state I was going to find them in. And if it wasn't someone that I knew, were they going to jump up and attack me? You know, so clearly I'm not the best person to have witness a situation like that, because I didn't think of all of the proper courses of action that I should have taken, which would have later helped us to identify who it was. Anyway, long story short, it was my landlord who was on the floor in the shed and had been beaten. And it was at this point where my sense and sensibility kicked in, and I realised I had to get him into the light so I could tend to his injuries, photograph them, take note of anything that he says about who they were or why they were there, and so on. And I was able to hand all that information over to the police when they came to take statements. But unfortunately, neither myself nor my landlord knew who these two people were. It apparently was some type of road rage incident where the landlord had said they had followed him for quite some time all the way home and into the driveway. The police then started interviewing people around the neighbourhood to see if they could figure out who it was. But it was our descriptions of the two people that sealed the deal against them. So when it came time for court, the defence argued we got the wrong guy, and the judge dropped my testimony where I described what he was wearing, his build, his hairstyle, and as he was leaving, he ran in front of his own headlights to get into the driver's side of the car, so also his tattoos. But in the interest of fairness, the judge dropped it, and we thought that's the end of it. He's going to win and get away with it. Right up till the end, till the judge gave his summary of the situation, and he surprised all of us. He said the defendant owned this particular type of car that was on the road in the middle of nowhere, where there were no other vehicles other than my landlord and the defendant driving along the road, and that he didn't believe that the defendant's car was a common car that would be on the road in the middle of nowhere at that particular hour of the day, and that it was the defendant's own testimony that he was in his car on that road at that particular hour of the day, although he denied following the landlord and or beating him. The judge ruled that it was his own testimony, not ours or our descriptions of him, that put him in the area at the time, along with a couple other details that he himself admitted to when he was on the stand. The judge ruled he was guilty and sentenced him to 12 months imprisonment. So what this says about the Idaho 4 suspect is that all he needs to do is admit he was there in Moscow for whatever reason, and then all his phone data is inconsequential. From an investigator's perspective, that phone data should encourage him to admit that he was there for whatever reason. Also, bear in mind, in our assault case, we had no phone data. We had no way to prove that this guy was actually there at our house that night. As the judge said, it was his own testimony that put him there. We saw a similar thing happen with the Suzanne Morphew case, where investigators came up with certain evidence, and then Barry Morphew decided he had to have a story to cover for that evidence, not realising that much of the evidence was really not going to be used for anything except to see if he made up a story to cover for it. And that's half the trick. You need their statement to seal them into this happened, and this happened. And then once you're in court, you don't need to prove that this happened, and this happened, because that's what they said happened. you will want to disprove that some of what they said didn't happen in order to attack their credibility. Hence, I do not expect to see much about the phone data during the trial. I'm fairly certain it was simply used to elicit from him an admission that he was in the area, for whatever reason. What I do expect to hear in the trial is the prosecution pick apart the reasoning that he says he was in the area for. Anyway, this is just another example of hindsight bias, where we can all listen to this story and know now that, hey, I should have been smart enough to take the frickin' number plate and maybe saved ourselves a little bit of drama along the way. And if you listen to my podcast, you probably already think I'm smart enough to have thought of that. But no, I was more concerned about the safety of the person being bashed and my own safety and not putting myself in the middle of it. Just as I am sure the housemates of the students were in the same mindset. Firstly, that there was no reason for them to believe that anything more or less nefarious than a stranger being in the house was occurring. And secondly, taking safety measures to ensure their own safety first, just in case something more nefarious could happen. Although I am certain that they would both feel regretful that they didn't think otherwise at the time. And we'll talk about survivor's guilt in just a bit, because I've got one more scenario to tell you about first. Now, this story goes back to, I think, maybe mid-90s-ish, or maybe even a little earlier, early 90s, I guess. Anyway, I just got home from work, and my partner at the time said to me, "Did you see what was on the news?" And obviously I didn't, because I'd been at work all day. So he goes on to inform me that there'd been a bank robbery at the Commonwealth Bank in the northern part of the township that we lived in. And he says they described the vehicle that the bank robber was driving. From that vehicle description, he said, "Doesn't your friend so-and-so own a vehicle just like that?" And it was true. One of my friends did actually own a vehicle exactly to the description of the bank robber's getaway vehicle. In my own defence, I will say that I wasn't friends with them for very long at the point that this happened. I was still getting to know them, and I had been a little bit worried about whether or not I would continue to make friends with them, because they were a couple and the husband had hit on me a couple of times, which, you know, being a married person, that's always a little bit uncomfortable. So at this particular stage of the game, I was kind of avoiding them more than trying to be friends with them. Anyway, I went straight into denial. They had a nice house, a nice car, a nice little family. I actually didn't think that they were in a financial predicament so bad that they would want to rob a bank. So, neither myself nor my partner at the time called the police to let them know that we knew someone who owned that type of car who lived in the northern suburbs. But sure enough, a couple of days later the news came along that they found the bank robber, and it was indeed this couple that I knew, or rather the husband. So again, in hindsight, yeah, maybe I should have spoken up, but I think I just did the natural, normal human thing and went straight into denial mode. And I wasn't alone. The wife also went into denial mode. She didn't know that it was him, and she didn't think that he had any reason to do that, but it turned out he did. When I rang to speak with her, she explained that she was on kidney dialysis, which is something I didn't know because, as I said, I didn't get to know them too well. And she explained that the kidney dialysis costs a lot of money, and so he was stressing about finances and somehow found robbing a bank was going to answer all their problems. And so I kind of felt a bit bad after that, you know. It did seem to me like a very human thing to flip out over the finances and the possible death of your wife to run off and rob a bank. I mean, I wouldn't do anything like that, but I did feel sorry for them. But there was also this nagging feeling that he didn't really deserve her loyalty because he wasn't loyal to her. Like, I knew he was playing up behind her back. And so after that phone call, you know, I just distanced myself from both of them. I don't know whatever happened to them. I know he went to jail, and rightfully so, but I don't know where they are today or whatever happened after that. So to relate that experience back to the Idaho case, I'm personally not going to point fingers at anybody who knew Kohberger and knew that he drove a white Elantra, but didn't report it to the police. Because it kind of feels like, it's a little bit like Dunning-Kruger effect, I guess. You sort of get into this state of mind thinking that you're such a good judge of character that nobody you know could do such a thing. I guess you just have to experience that process of thinking, no one I know could be like that, discovering that they actually are, and that you really aren't as good a judge of character as you really think you are, to be able to understand that dynamic. And I guess that's a moral to all three stories that I've told here. Until you've actually been there in that situation, you don't really know how you're going to react. You don't know how your brain is going to compute what's going on around you without any hindsight or forewarning, both of which we have the benefit of as purveyors of the crime genre. I don't know about anybody else, but my brain likes to go into, given these circumstances, a mode where the most logical explanation is the explanation. You know, these things are individual amongst all of us. How we deal with grief, how we deal with an emergency, how we deal with stress. These are all very unique and individual things. And no matter how much you train your brain, like in my situation, I know that I'm supposed to write down the vehicle tag if something involving a vehicle is going down at that time. But in the situation, I didn't think of it right away. It was well after that vehicle had left our property that I realised I should have done that. That doesn't mean that the next person is going to have the same frame of mind or the same response pattern. And so the whole why didn't they do this and why didn't they do that, blah blah blah, just makes no sense to me. It actually removes individuality from the equation. We have no problems accepting that we are all unique humans with unique feelings and individuality, but when it comes to crime, no, we're all the same. We all have to behave the same and act the same and should all have the same responses and so on. Anyway, that's the three scenarios that came to mind when I was looking over the details of this case and considered how I reacted at the time versus how I reacted afterwards, and how I think about it now in hindsight. And now I'm going to shush and let you guys have your say. Can you recall any scenarios that you have experienced in which, given hindsight, you might have acted differently, and or where you can sympathise with the surviving victims in the Idaho case? Let me know below and we'll discuss there in the comments section who is interested in coming onto a live stream to talk about it.